As you know, we focus on topics that are across the gamut, from just starting to be veg curious all the way over to vegan activism and so forth. For today, we're going to touch upon a topic that's not exactly very pleasant, but we do hope will be very meaningful for you. There are times where we have these animals in our lives in different manners, and when they pass, when we lose one, how do we deal with that loss? So if you've been a vegan veteran, let's say, or maybe you're an activist standing for animals, knowing that sheer number and volume of animals that are killed every year, I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of them. So that kind of understanding in and of itself, and knowing that they're dying, that loss is really tough for vegans to process. And then, what if it's the case that you have a more direct relationship with the animal? So like us here at the sanctuary or other sanctuaries that maybe care for 100, 200 animals. You're giving unwavering support to those animals. And when they pass, it might be one in a crowd, but you still have to process, gosh, now that animal has gone. Or for those of you, you may not be running a sanctuary and caregiving in that sense, but you've had an animal, a companion animal in your life, and has become part of your family, a cat, a dog, let's say, and then they pass after 10, 20 years. I mean, that bond or that relationship is so intimate. How do we deal with that loss? So wherever you are, whether it's dealing with it on a massive scale, on maybe a one in a crowd, or something a little bit more intimate, we've invited a wonderful panel of guests to have this conversation because we do think it is extremely important. And so for someone out there that might be dealing with loss right now or recently, we really, really want to let you know that we're here to support you and hope you find a lot of value from this episode.
We've invited, firstly, Christopher Soul Eubanks, a social justice advocate, creative, and public speaker, raised in Atlanta, Georgia. He has lectured for animals' rights at universities and events across the U.S. And in 2019, he helped to co-organize Atlanta's first ever Animal Rights March. Founder of APEX Advocacy, a Black Indigenous person of color-led animal rights organization that creates grassroots initiatives and campaigns to help create more BIPOC animal rights advocates and leaders. Secondly, Jennifer Long, founder and executive director of the Muddy Pug Farm and Sanctuary, a 501c3 nonprofit in Hobart, Washington. Founded in 2020, focusing on saving lives and giving sanctuary to over 40 animal residents and building community. And lastly, Jen Blau, a licensed professional counselor who is certified in compassion fatigue, pet loss grief, and trauma. She's the owner of Deepwater Counseling and the author of To Save a Starfish, a compassion fatigue workbook for the animal welfare warrior. As a vegan, former shelter worker, and animal control officer, Jen has an extensive background in animal welfare and animal rights, and is passionate about helping those who love, care for, and work to protect animals. We welcome you all.
Hi, everyone. Oh my goodness. Thank you so very much, Jen, Jennifer, and Chris, for joining Ella and I on Beat Around the Barn for this very important episode. It's quite near and dear to Ella and my heart. And we hope that we'll be able to provide some of this insight or just ways that you can move forward if you yourself are dealing with loss of an animal in your life. And we usually refer to it as crossing the rainbow bridge, right, with our animals. Now, the expertise of Jen, Jennifer, and Chris, we think will lend itself really, really well here, and hope that you find a lot of value out of this episode. So having said that, we actually would like to start where we define what grieving really is. I know many of us may have felt it at different points with different loved ones in our lives, but what exactly is grieving? And Jen, with your background in counseling, we thought maybe you might start us off with a definition or some type of understanding there.
Sure. So I'll give you a very short definition, and then there's a not so simple definition. So the simple definition is grief is a deep, deep sorrow for the loss, usually, but not always, but usually the death of a loved one. And that can include a human or non-human. It can be the loss of a divorce, that's an example of a loss of a job, loss of a home. But when we talk about grief, we typically think of that deep sorrow that comes with death. The not so simple answer, which I think we'll kind of explore as we go along, is grief is really defined by the culture you're in. It's defined by the relationship you had with the human or animal. It's defined by society's acceptance of grief. And that's what makes grief so unique. So that's kind of the long and the short answer.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that we are trying to dive into this topic, looking at it from multiple angles. I think that when somebody experiences the loss of, say, their companion animal passing, they really understand that, wow, because a lot of times those animals become your family or a piece of your heart and soul, right? And with us at Hogs and Kisses, and then I know at Muddy Pug, right, we're caregivers now for those animals, right? And so you are developing some type of relationship with them. And in some cases, they do start to feel like family. But then if we even step back from that, as vegans in general, right, vegans on maybe even a daily basis, but certainly the sheer volume and number of animals that pass per year, we're talking in the billions. Many of us feel grieving about that, and we have even no relationship with those animals. What do we all think about that, in terms of now understanding sorrow at that kind of level?
So I think it's important to remember that we don't necessarily have to have a personal relationship with an animal. So people, and vegans in particular, seem to have a love or an affinity for animals that goes a lot deeper than your average person, maybe who consumes meat, and there's kind of that disconnect there, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. I think a lot of vegans, if not most, have higher levels of empathy. And I won't get into kind of the brain biology involved in that. We tend to have higher levels of compassion. We definitely have a higher level of awareness, and we have an awareness that we are not really capable of kind of that disconnect that most people feel. They love their dog, but they'll eat a cow, and there's that disconnect. I think vegans, we're incapable of turning that off. And so we can also relate to animals. So for example, if you, and this is not always the case, but if you were abused as a child, or if you felt isolated or lonely as a child, or oppressed as a child, or bullied as a child, we can often kind of identify with the abuse or the neglect, or just the mistreatment in general, of animals, even if we don't know them. And so we can form this attachment towards animals in general. And then there also is the issue of, this is a loss of an innocent, pure life. And I think as vegans, we highly value life. We tend to live in a kind of a throwaway society, but I think we value life so much, so that you can identify with animals. You can just identify with the feeling that it's a life lost. And there's also the injustice piece. I mean, I could go on the whole hour, but I'll.
And I think Jen touched on something important, that it is that there isn't that disconnect or dissociation that you have when you are following a vegan sort of diet and lifestyle. You've sort of removed that barrier, that sort of psychological barrier that I think people put in their minds to allow them to have companion animals while consuming other animals. And I think the other challenge that we face is really the scope and scale of the issue. Anne-Marie, you really touched on it, that kind of literally billions of animals each year are consumed in farm animal agriculture. And that problem not only hits home individually, but the sheer magnitude of the issue is overwhelming in its scale and sort of the grief that comes from it.
Mhm.
I think that's so important to realize too. And I kind of think back to, from a personal standpoint, when I was 7 and I made the connection with the food on my plate, with the animal it was. And for me, it was like right at that place in our lives where I guess I hadn't been totally programmed yet by society. And I was able to see it for what it was. And I was like, what in the world are we doing? Like, why are we eating an animal? There's so many other things we can eat. It doesn't make any sense to me. And then I started doing the research and started seeing the videos. And, this is back in, oh my God, 1987. So there wasn't much out there, but I sought that information out. And it was devastating to me. And to survive and not be in a constant state of total devastation, there has to be some, and I'd love to hear maybe from you, Jen, about this. There has to be that coping mechanism to be able to survive in this world and communicate, because I didn't even know any other vegans at that time. People didn't see the world like I saw it. It was like I was this alien seeing, having this perspective that nobody else seemed to have. And it was very heartbreaking to me that people, I thought in my young mind, I said, well, if only people knew, because I didn't know. And then I knew, and then I stopped eating animals. So obviously, if I just let everybody know what's going on that they don't know about, they're going to stop too. And then that reality of, no, that wasn't the case. People can know and still do it. And the grief around that was, is compounding, but we have to live in this world. So how do we, and I guess I did that, naturally as a surviving mechanism. There has to still be some sort of a wall that I put up so that I can still live in this world without being in a horrible state. Does that make sense? I'm wondering if there's any of the psychological, information around that.
Yeah, and everything that you're talking about, I've been through as well, and I've really, really struggled with it. Two things. So grief in and of itself is a form of trauma. That is something that we really, first of all, at least in Western culture, we don't like to talk about death. We don't like to talk about it. We don't want to think about it. It is a form of trauma, and that's something that I don't think is really recognized. And just to kind of go back to what you were saying about, when you start to become educated as a vegan and you're watching these videos, first of all, you can't unsee what you've seen. It's one thing to recognize when you're a child, and I had kind of the same epiphany. I was eating a McDonald's hamburger, and I asked my mom, what are these? There's crunchy things in here. And she said, oh, it's probably just bits of bone. And I said, hold up, what? And that's no more. I think it's one thing to have this recognitions of billions of lives being lost every year. It's another thing to have an awareness of what happens prior and during that death. I think, at least for me, that is more traumatic than the actual death itself. And so again, it's really important that we recognize that grief is a form of trauma. And there are lots of coping skills, but one of the things that helped me the most, and it seems so simple yet so profound, at least for me, and I'd love to hear from Chris as an activist how he copes, because he is deep in the trenches. There's a man named Eric Gentry, and he is a compassion fatigue expert, psychologist and compassion fatigue expert. And I did a training with him, and he said to me, Jen, there is a difference between pain and suffering. And I didn't get it for the longest time. And then I realized, if you are in this movement, if this is your lifestyle, you will feel pain. As a compassion fatigue expert myself, there is nothing I can do to help that. I cannot take that away. Can't take it away from you. I can't take it away from myself. But that doesn't mean that we have to suffer, right? So pain is feeling bad about something and then moving on. Suffering is staying entrenched. And that's what I've done for, honestly, for most of my life, is I have been entrenched in that deep suffering. And I'm only recently kind of coming out of that suffering and realizing I'm going to have good days, but then there's going to be very painful moments, and there's going to be very painful days. But I can get myself back out of it as long as I have this very robust, huge toolbox of coping skills, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So Chris, when you're in the trenches, how is it for you? And is then activism an outlet for that?
Absolutely. So I will say it's two things that I've realized around how to cope with these feelings. The first was, to Ella's point, when you are newly vegan, you realize all of the suffering that's happening, and still and has happened. You want to tell the world, and you want to understand why people still do this, even though they know what is happening. And I think the way that I initially started to deal with these feelings was to be active, was to actually do something and take a stance or take an action to actually combat what I'm feeling, or to combat this normalcy of animal exploitation and abuse. So that was the first thing I did, was to actually put my energy and focus it somewhere, because up until then, it was just sitting in me. And, to Jen's point, it was almost that suffering that I was allowing myself to sit in, when I was just so confused and, talking to friends and family members and trying to talk to them about veganism and talk to them about not supporting any form of animal exploitation. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to put my energy. So once I found an outlet of activism, that really helped to take some of the weight off of my shoulder on one end. But as I began to start doing activism, I started to really feel that fatigue come on, that compassion fatigue, and going to vigils, every other week. For those that may not know, vigils are when you go to a slaughterhouse, you see the trucks of animals coming in, you film and take pictures and try to share that with the world. You also try to give them water or comfort them in any way, that anything you can do in their last moments before they are sent into the slaughterhouse, you are there for them, you are bearing witness. So I was a SAVE organizer. I organized these vigils for years. And one of the things that I realized after doing activism for a prolonged period of time was that I had to find a way to compartmentalize my advocacy and who I was as a person. So what that ended up being for me was realizing that, okay, I have to do activism from 9 to 5, because that's the only way that I can actually cope with all of these feelings. And then outside of that, outside of the work, I can be my normal self. I can watch Netflix, I can go dance and go to the club, go to the movies, and still be allowed to be my human self. And I think that's the biggest thing that has helped me, is understanding that, okay, I am going to devote myself to this fully, going to give everything that I can, but from 9 to 5, I have to do it in that window, because if not, I'm going to burn out. I still have to allow me space and energy to be an individual, because if we liberate all the animals, if we liberate all the people on earth, what are we going to do then if we're not used to being individuals and used to having space for ourselves? So I think finding a way to channel my energy was the first thing, and then finding a way to compartmentalize to allow myself to be an individual was the second thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just love that you're saying this, because I'm actually living this right now. I have not mastered it by any means whatsoever, but I am learning how to create a boundary, because maybe Jennifer too, maybe you experienced this, right? We are a micro sanctuary at Hogs and Kisses. So we have 10 beautiful souls that we care for, right? But I'll tell you, Mama Bear in me comes out if anything, right? Like I will lay down on train tracks for these animals, you know, so any little thing. And I'm thinking, if I don't, then I'm not honoring their lives. Like I put this kind of thing there, you know, an expectation for me to go and be constantly at their beck and call. But I have to, as like you're saying, while I am doing a beautiful, and I love what we're doing, right? And I love the animals, I do need to make sure I preserve myself and my well-being in order to continue to care, right, for them and stand for the movement overall, right? Yeah. How about you, Jennifer? Do you feel the same, or I don't know, have you worked that out for yourself in caring for animals?
It is a constant work in progress, and I think Anne-Marie, you and Christopher, you also experience that when this is sort of your life's work, you do have to figure out where sort of the activist, where the sanctuary operator ends and the human being begins, and to give yourself sort of permission to cross that threshold whenever you need to. I think you're really smart to draw sort of a time boundary around it, because that helps to preserve you. I think, Anne-Marie, for you and I as sanctuary operators, you live where you work. And it is very difficult to have a sort of boundary in that way, because when something comes up, you have to respond to it. When someone is sick on the sanctuary, you have to care for them. And so it's sort of, for myself, what I've found really helpful is understanding a framework. And Jen, maybe you could speak to this, to know of when I'm in danger. So I know I'm in danger when I'm not sleeping. I know I'm in danger when I'm not taking care of myself. I know I'm in danger when I haven't spent time with someone else besides all of the residents of the sanctuary. And so sort of having that mental framework in your mind helps you to recognize the signs that you're getting fatigued or you're getting burned out. And then I think also having a plan for after. So it's sort of a, if I see this, then. If I feel lonely, then I'm going to reach out to someone. If I feel like I'm tired, I'm going to build time into my day to rest. And having that sort of structure really helps me to find some type of balance.
Yeah, because as you were talking there, and I'm thinking through, right? So if I think about as a vegan and how we feel about all these animals passing, right? And that we want to do something. So now we put our energy into doing something, right? So it could be activism, maybe it's sanctuary care, you know, whatever it is, starting a vegan business, right? All of these things. So now the care of those animals, it's a different kind of response, like you're saying, because it's your job is that care, or your job is that activism, right? Then I'm thinking now to my companion animals, who are my cats, and I always joke that I birthed those two, and no one can tell me any different, right? If those animals, if my companion animals, Santiago and Sophia, if they pass, but my sanctuary animals pass, or then all 160 billion of the pigs that pass every year, I respond to them very, very differently, even though the sorrow may be the same. But because with my companion animals, while I will absolutely be distraught when they pass, but I will feel so proud of the life that I gave them, you know, and how much I went above and beyond when I rescued them. But yet at the sanctuary, I really wonder. I will start to say to myself, did I do enough? Is it okay? You know, are their siblings grieving now? And what do I mean? You know, there will still be this doing, right? Then, and when I think about it at this whole level, I think it goes back to, maybe it was Ella who said, the feeling there is a little more of like an overwhelm, because it's 160 billion or so of just pigs alone, right? And we're in a world where, 2% are vegan, right? You know, so it's so many different levels of feelings that are going on depending upon these contexts. Does that make sense to you all?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now might be a good time to talk about a concept that I think is just really, really important. Whether you are a companion animal, caregiver, a vegan activist, regardless, animal loss falls under a term that we call disenfranchised grief. So not that any type of grief is quote unquote normal, but society has deemed that there is a healthy type of grieving, okay? Disenfranchised grief is a type of grief that is not widely recognized by society, okay? Some examples of this might be the death of a same-sex partner, okay? Death by suicide or overdose, ecological grief, grief over climate change, and certainly companion animal grief. Now, we are slowly getting better with the companion animal grief. I mean, there's books on my bookshelf now about pet loss. 20 years ago, I don't think you could find a book on pet loss. 20 years ago, you couldn't find a card to send somebody who lost an animal, right? It's still a form of disenfranchised grief. And I think it gets worse, right? So you're a companion animal caregiver. That's a type of disenfranchised grief. Now you're an animal sanctuary caregiver. That's even more disenfranchised. And God forbid you grieve for the billions of animals who you don't even know. And be it cows and pigs, right? Because they are less worthy than dogs and cats. Now you're in a very, very serious form of disenfranchised grief. And the problem with disenfranchised grief is we internalize what society tells us we're allowed to grieve for, how we're allowed to grieve, how long we're allowed to grieve. And if society's telling us that's not worthy, we withdraw, we isolate ourselves, we feel, someone mentioned at the beginning, we feel like an alien in this world. Why do I feel so deeply? What's wrong with me? The biggest problem with disenfranchised grief is that we typically will stuff our feelings down. We will not allow ourselves to go there. And disenfranchised grief can ultimately lead to complicated grief. And I won't go into the specifics, but complicated grief, we risk we risk developing depression, even PTSD. Okay, grief has to be worked through. It does not just go away. We run the risk of suicide, of getting stuck. And so the problem with especially being a vegan is there's kind of this low level chronic grief that's happening every day. So I think I just want people to kind of have an awareness that there is a term for this. And regardless of what society says, it is perfectly normal, perfectly healthy for you. You should grieve animals. I've done presentations and workshops with animal sanctuaries around the country. And there's one thing that I hear from everyone: we don't have time to grieve. We don't have time to grieve. We don't have time. All you sanctuary owners out there better be listening. You better make time, because your people will burn out if they are not allowed to grieve.
Wow, that's really hitting home for me, Jen. Thank you for that. And I have to wonder, I mean, I'm very good at being open and sharing now in my life. And I was 15 when I went totally vegan. I became an animal rights activist at 15. And it was at 16, I was diagnosed with depression and put on medication. So I have to wonder, which I've recently finally gotten off of after 20 some years. But I think it had to have something to do with being in that place of feeling alien and having nobody can possibly understand what I was feeling for these billions of animals, and doing the activism and then retreating back into myself and saying, okay, well, then the only way people are open to hearing about what's going on is for me through my physical accomplishment. So I became a a bodybuilder and won competition. So people would be like, oh, how'd you get the muscles? And that developed into disordered eating and a body image issue because I, had to be perfect then. And just so much of my life has revolved around, what can I do to fulfill my mission of saving animals, that I lost my ability to experience pleasure. And that's something I'm working with a coach today on accessing pleasure, because who am I to be worthy of experiencing pleasure in my life when there's so much suffering happening, and that's just so entrenched in kind of who I've become, which I'm working through now. But then when Bob passed, that was my beloved cat Bob, passed traumatically in July, not of old age. He had an accident. He fell off my balcony and in front of me. And it was something that I guess that was almost 5 months ago, grieving very heavily for. And when I was able to talk about that, like on social media, the amount of people that could relate and who offered me all sorts of sympathy was extraordinary. And I did that, I'm kind of in a bit of a bubble of who I'm surrounded with, and it's a lot of animal lovers. But it felt very different than the grieving of, the masses. So that makes so much sense, what you said.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, kind of getting back to what Chris said. Chris said, 9 to 5, this is who I am. After 5 o'clock, this is who I am. This is who I am. This is who I am. So one thing that I work on with my own coaching clients is I have them finish the sentence, I am a vegan and I am also a fill in the blank, right? So if I took myself, for example, I am a vegan, but I am also a wife. I am a vegan. I'm also a sister. I am a vegan. I'm also a drummer. I am a vegan. I'm also I wouldn't call myself a bodybuilder, but a gym rat, right? So, and for Chris, I'm an activist and a vegan, but I'm also this. So you have other identities that you have to express those other identities, or you can become lost and burned out very quickly. And those of us who care the most are the most vulnerable to compassion fatigue and burnout.
Mm. Ella, I just want to acknowledge how open you are, and I am so sorry for the loss of Bob, and I know how devastating it is to kind of bear witness, and especially something that's unanticipated or an accident. So I am so sorry for your loss. At the risk of kind of directing the conversation, Christopher, I would really love to hear from you on how you manage the kind of grief and translate that into purpose. I think that's something we really focus on the sanctuary, is sort of how do you galvanize and find meaning and purpose and move into action?
I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that I had to allow myself to do is, I would say the first thing I did was I did any and everything. I was, organizing for this organization, for that organization, doing local events, just any and everything that I could to devote myself to advocating. But what I began to also do was to say, you know what? I don't like this type of activism. This isn't for me. This doesn't sit right with me. I get nervous or I get anxiety around doing X type of activism. And I'm not going to do that. I had to allow myself to say, you know what? I have to care for myself. And that actually looks like allowing myself to say no to particular things and particular situations. And I think another thing that helped with that is also realizing that 24/7 all around the world, there are people advocating for animals at every given moment of the day. There's someone, this is a whole team. It's not just us by ourselves. I know a lot of times with this grief, and I'm glad that Jen brought up the disenfranchised grief. And we deal with that on a variety of levels. I think about just going into a grocery store. Like there are times when I go into a grocery store past the meat section, and it is horrible. Like I don't, all of us, we don't just see items, we see bodies, we see literal bodies, and that's hurtful. I get to the point where now I can do it a little easier, but sometimes it still hits me. But I think I had to allow myself to, one, say, you know what, they doing this type of action or doing this thing or participating in XYZ event isn't what is it isn't the best way for me to give my energy. So I'm going to let others take on those responsibilities, and I'm going to put my energy where I feel it is the most efficient and most effective. And it didn't happen overnight. I mean, for years I did things that I kind of felt were necessary or was expected of me as a person that loves animals and care for animals. And after a while, I got burnt out, and I really had to look in the mirror and say, you know what, I want to focus my energy and time into these specific areas. So, that could mean, you know what, I don't want to do a disruption where I go into a area like a grocery store or a restaurant, going with megaphones and protesting inside of these places. There's totally incredible people that are doing that, but maybe that's not for me. Maybe I'm better at organizing marches, or maybe I'm better at doing leafleting or outreaching to people or doing social media. So just finding what way is sustainable for you, because I think that's what it really takes, is to have people that's going to be in this fight for 60, 70, 80 years, instead of people that are going to be in this fight for a couple of years and burn out. We need people that are going to be sustainable. So I think that's what it looks like, is finding what type of way you can contribute that is sustainable in long term for you.
Yeah, I love that you're saying it that way, Chris, because as I had been learning about how to start a micro sanctuary and things like that, of course, I reached out to the Micro Sanctuary Resource Center, Van Cleeks, and they do such a beautiful job of describing that actually caregiving to animals is a form of activism, because I myself am not one to stand out on the street or some of the more typical traditional types of activism. But I do feel a real strong pull towards providing care for animals. And in many ways, that's actually where I fill my cup. That's where I get my energy and my charge, is because when I'm with the animals, it's like the world goes silent, and that is purpose right there, in and of itself. So, for us, or me, I have chosen, that path. And then, yes, we do things like educating on other issues that are tangential to it. Right. But for that very reason of finding what I feel I'm putting myself into as my self-expression.
It's so important to bear in mind that there is no right way to do this work. And it really requires a level of mindfulness and self-reflection. I think, Christopher, you've done an amazing job of really understanding yourself over time and sort of unpacking what gives you strength, what gives you energy, because this is not a sort of one and done journey that we're all on. And it is something that you want to be able to sustain over time. It is going to be very difficult. It's going to be, physically difficult for some people and the work they do, or emotionally difficult. And you want it to be sustainable and to be able to work from a place of strength. And if you're sort of doing things that aren't true to your strengths, or actually disproportionately sap your energy, you're not going to be effective in this work over time. It's going to take its toll on you, especially when things get very difficult around loss and grief. That is where you really kind of touch the bottom of the pool for what your capacity is. And so it's so important to have your cup full, as Anne Marie said, in order to be able to move forward for a long period of time.
I think Chris said the magic word. I think the magic word is sustainable. And he also kind of talked about how his activism has changed throughout his life, right? And I don't know if you all feel the same way, but my activism has definitely changed too. So when I was younger, it was more about the protest and the writing letters and the, kind of more in the trenches. And then, of course, I worked professionally as a shelter worker, animal control officer. And these days, my activism is more helping the people that help the animals. So becoming a therapist for vegans and activists. And then more recently, just as Ella was kind of alluding to, I'd say for about the past year, I have been working on really going through recomposition with my body. So building my strength, trying to get ripped, and really being on point with my nutrition, because I want to walk around in vegan t-shirts or, powered by tofu t-shirts and I want people to say, damn, like that's a vegan. So I want to lead by example, and I want to start conversations that way, because at this age, I am a lot less kind of in your face and more like kind of like sit back and you come to me. I don't want to be this stereotypical scrawny, angry vegan. I want to just be fit mentally and physically. And like I said, just have people say, damn, if that's what a vegan is, I want to talk to you.
So good. Yeah. So let's recap here, because I think overwhelmingly we're hearing that with grieving, and you have sorrow, and whether it's on a mass level of animals or caregiving or a personal family member as your animal, that sorrow, right? We are all looking for ways to channel it into a sustainable way to continue the movement, but also for our own selves and our own self-expression. Are there any other recommendations we have for everyone as we kind of wrap things up here?
I'll quickly say, I don't know if this is a recommendation or just something that I think people should be aware of, is that you don't necessarily have to love or care for animals in the traditional sense of wanting to be around them to know that, they should deserve a life of freedom and a life where they have ownership over their and autonomy over their bodies. I'll be the first to admit, while I have absolutely cried at vigils, I've seen, chickens' heads literally on the side of slaughterhouses because, rare body parts get cut off in these facilities. But, I may not be the person to have a companion animal. I don't necessarily see myself as a animal person per se. But that doesn't mean that you can't do this work. You can still do this work or care for animals or stand up against exploitation, even if you don't have a personal connection or want to be around animals all the time. And as much as I love sanctuaries, I tell people this all the time. If I never visit one again, I'll be okay. That doesn't mean that I'm just heartless and don't care for animals. It just means that I'm okay not being around animals like that or having that personal bond. But that has nothing, that bears no, has no impact on my ability to care for their existence. So I think we can have those things, and they're not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely. Yeah, really great, because it gives us another place to stand and really be able to channel our feelings, through in a way that supports the movement forward.
I'm curious.
Any other thoughts? Yeah,
I'm actually curious if Jennifer, if you all have a process in place for assisting in the grieving process at your sanctuary when there's an animal loss.
We do. And so I operate the sanctuary with my husband, and we both have individual counselors that we work with because the work is so emotionally taxing. I think that I can't recall who said it in the discussion, maybe it was Jen, who talked about sort of pain versus suffering. And we have developed a framework, and most sanctuaries have developed a framework to understand when it's time. And in many ways, knowing when it's time helps alleviate the anguish and suffering, because you're moving to a place of, I am going to help, we call them residents. I am going to help this resident make a peaceful transition that honors their life. And in that way, when you operate from that place, I wouldn't say that easier is the term, but it's more manageable emotionally. And you can find meaning and purpose in that transition in a way that helps, I would say, expedite healing, for lack of a better word, and that helps you to understand and move through that grief in a way that's a little more productive.
And I'll just kind of add to, what you were saying about having your own counselors. I think that is great. Not that everyone who is grieving or in this movement needs, well, honestly, I think everybody needs a counselor. That's another show. So, I mean, there's so many ways to honor an animal, right? I mean, you could get a tattoo, you could donate to your favorite cause, you could have a website kind of devoted to that animal. You can throw yourself into activism. There's so many different things you can do. But I want to kind of touch on counseling. For those who are watching, if you do decide, first of all, no shame in seeing a counselor. The strongest people in this world go to counselors because it is tough. It is tough to face your demons. If you, whether you're in this work or you're grieving an animal and you go to a counselor and they are dismissive, they seem traumatized. 2 red flags: you are with the wrong counselor. Finish the session, get up, walk away, and find another counselor. Okay. Your counselor should be able to validate your grief and handle your trauma. If not, you're with the wrong counselor. Please try again.
Really, really awesome.
One last little point.
Yeah, go for it.
I will just throw out there is one thing that made a difference. I feel like for me this time around was my ability to be with my feelings and to allow myself to feel completely however I was feeling. And it meant not being able to jump back into work. It meant feeling really miserable for quite some time. And what I just kind of coached myself through that as, it's okay. You get to feel however you're feeling, and to just give myself permission. And so I want to encourage people to give themselves permission to feel however you're feeling, and to know that that's really, the quote I used was, the only way out is through. So I didn't try to run or hide or distract myself or numb my feelings. I really sat with them, and it was horribly uncomfortable, but I think it made a big difference in the big picture.
And I'll just say one last thing. Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth, said that grief is the price we pay for love. It's a price I'm willing to pay.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's with this topic being such a sensitive one, I just want to thank everybody for showing up, sharing your experiences and your recommendations. By all means, we are all here going through it together. So we are all collectively, right, doing this because of what we believe and doing right by animals, right? Ultimately, that's what we want. So whatever space you are in, I think ultimately everybody's saying, feel it, go through it, but yes, absolutely put it to some good use as well. I hope that you got some great nuggets today, some golden nuggets on some things that might help you through your own journey as well. So thanks for giving us your time today.
Boy, we sure did cover a lot of ground, and we hope that you found something meaningful for you. If you're dealing with loss of animals at the moment, by all means, put some notes or questions in the comments. We're happy to connect you with our panelists, and we really do wish you well on this journey as you are going through grieving and healing. Thanks for joining us on Beat Around the Barn.